Welcome everybody to OTF Webinars, Webinar Connects. My name is Trish Morgan. I'm your moderator tonight, and I'm very happy to welcome you to Reassessing Assessment using digital tools. We have a couple of terrific presenters for you tonight, Andrew Broadsky and Jamie Rayburn. And as you could tell from the earlier chat, they are indeed from the WRDSB, where I'm from as well, and I've had the luck of crossing paths with them over the last few years, and I know that these two are always after the newest and the best for teachers. And they, once again, have come up with something that they think will be extremely helpful to you. I'm looking forward to hearing about this one as well, too. So, without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our presenters, Andrew and Jamie.
Thank you for those very kind words, Trish, and thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm always continually blown away by the passion of Ontario educators to get up at night of their own time for an hour and a half to jump in and kind of look at their own professional development learning. So thank you all for joining us. As Trish said, my name is Andrew Broadsky. I'm a high school English teacher in the Waterloo region at Huron Heights Secondary School. I personally I love being in the classroom. I love kind of following along things, and I'm very excited to talk about assessment tonight and assessment practices. Yes, I am that geeky. And on my spare time, I actually help put on an event called TEDx Kitchen Red. And I'll now pass over to my colleague, Jamie Rayburn, to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Jamie Rayburn, and I also teach at Huron Heights in the WRDSB. And I'm in fact actually the department head of English in our building. And so the idea of triangulation and thinking about assessment is really something that's quite important to me because of my role within the school and within the board, and thinking about what we can be doing for our students and to be doing the absolute best job that we can be doing, because I know that's what every teacher wants, is to truly be doing what we think is the best for our students. And so that's, yeah, me, I guess. So what we wanted to start with is that last year Andrew and I were so fortunate to be involved with a TLLP, a Teacher Learning and Leadership Program put on by the Ministry of Education. And we received a grant from the Ministry of Education, and what it allowed us to do was to really follow some of our passions about learning. And if you haven't heard of the TLLP, it's something to really look into, because what it allowed us to do is self-directed teacher professional learning. And we spend a lot of time thinking about what we are really passionate about in the classroom. And Andrew himself, on many occasions I've heard him say how much he loves the growing success document. And so with that in mind, we spend a lot of time thinking about the triangulation of data. We're secondary teachers, and so we probably have some elementary teachers in the room, but the triangulation of data using conversations and observations is typically not done well at the secondary level. And what we wanted to really do was explore that from a perspective of how can we know this is good pedagogy, but how do we actually do that at the secondary level, as well as at the elementary level too. Plus, Andrew and I are super geeky when it comes to technology, him far more than I am. I'm going to give him that credit. He's far geekier than I am in terms of technology, but we're always looking for ways to make our job also easier, because as we know, there are so many pressures on us. So part of our TLP was thinking about, okay, this is good pedagogy, but then how do we actually do this in a way that's manageable and meaningful for both us and the students?
Okay, and thanks for that kind of intro to the TLP, Jamie. I thought I'd throw a quick couple polls at the audience here very quickly just to check in with you guys. First off, are both Jamie and I sounding okay to everybody? If you can give us a green check mark to say things sound all right, or a red X if we're not sounding too good. Starting off with green check marks, that's a good sign. Not seeing too many red X's there. Okay, so the sound seems good. All right, I'm going to clear that one. And one more here, I'm just curious. Jamie mentioned the TLLP, which is, again, the Teacher Learning Leadership Program, which, again, was a research project we did last year through the Ministry of Education, and it's a partnership with the Ontario Teachers Federation, actually. I'm just curious, because I always love asking teachers this. Who in the room here has heard of the TLLP before? A green check mark if you're familiar with it, red X if you're not familiar with it. Okay, so it looks like a bit more of a majority there of people who haven't heard of it. I highly recommend you look into it. It's province-wide. I think pretty much the only requirements are you have to be teaching for 4 years, I believe, if I'm correct. And it's a great opportunity to, through the ministry, get a grant for funding, and also through Ontario Teachers Federation. And it's really a chance to go and explore and try new things in your classroom and get support in a whole bunch of ways. Truly looking across the province, I actually think it's the best professional development you can get, right along with OTF Connects here tonight, which I'm also a big fan of here too. With that in mind, I highly encourage people to check it out. And it really gave us a chance to play and really look at how we looked at assessment in our classrooms and try and experiment new things. And a lot of what we're going to be sharing with you tonight really kind of came out of the two of us kind of experimenting in that space and looking at different ways of how we look at assessment in classrooms. And also, I can say for myself here too, I love doing what's best for my students, but I'm also very conscious of my time. And so finding ways to do new and maybe what might be seen as innovative things, but at the same time not creating more work for yourself. And so that's what we hope to speak to and kind of share with a lot of you tonight. So we're going to have to the next slide here, and I'll pass it back over to Jamie.
Okay, so as Grant Wiggins says, the point of school is not to get good at school. And for so many of our students, really, they're just there to, they feel in many ways that they have to perform for us on certain tasks at certain times. And what we really wanted to do was we wanted students to really focus on the idea of learning, and that make that part of our culture of our classrooms is not necessarily just to be thinking about, okay, my teacher's going to assess me on this day at this time, and therefore I will then play the game of school and be good at those particular times, and not really thinking about the idea of learning at the heart of it. And so what we really wanted to do was we wanted to create a culture of learners within our classrooms. And so, especially when I look at, for example, like I'm teaching in 12 University right now, and I love those students, but for so many of them, they're focused on, I need the mark because I need university. I need to get into university, so I have to get a good grade in your class. Just tell me what it is you need me to do so when I get the level 4 and get out, because I'm not focused on the area, I'm focused on the grade. And so we wanted to really think about how we could shift that culture within our classrooms to be thinking about, I'm here now, what do I need to do to get the next part of my learning journey? And so it's a really big culture shift, and truthfully, it's something that we have to really help reframe for our parents as well, because many of us came through the system of that you do well on the product, you do well on the test, the assignment, whatever, and then therefore you've learned, and I'm using air quotes here in the living room, air quotes around that's learning, and that's not really what learning actually is. And so I think it's thinking about how do we retrain them.
Hold on a second. I got some calls over there as a chat.
Okay, so we did a check before and about people starting. So out of curiosity here, like it sounds like some people said I'm coming through okay. I just want to do a check again. How is, if just on Jamie right now, who green check mark if you thought you could hear Jamie okay, and red check mark if you couldn't hear her very well. Okay, so Jamie's not coming through great there, but I am. We'll play around with that. We tested earlier at the start of the conversation, and Jamie was coming through fine, but we will definitely play around with that and get that fixed. So we will check in with you again on that, and Jamie's going to try a few different things to that. There too. Okay, so adding to what Jamie said, I just kind of want to jump on. I just want to put the mic in the background. I don't think anyone else is showing with the mic on right now. Sharon, it's a good question. Actually, Cindy, I see your mic is on right now. So Cindy CH, if you could actually, if you're not sure how, if you look up in the top left under your profile, there's a talk button, you click on talk there and turn that off, that would be great, because we don't want to have more than one mic on here. So Cindy, if you're there, if you could click on the top left on the button that says talk to turn the mic off, that would be great. And we'll continue on here and just kind of jump on into some of what Jamie was saying there is, when we're playing around with assessment and looking at ideas like growing success and monitoring that space and looking at the triangulation of data, a key piece is that we got to keep in mind that a lot of times this will be new for our students. And so the culture you look at in your classroom becomes very important, and how you look at that space and how you play with that space. And that was definitely our experience this past year as we tried experimenting and doing different things with this, is that we also really focused on how it affects our students and creating awareness for them, really openly talking about what we are doing in our classroom and how we look at assessment to make them aware of that. And so our plan for the presentation tonight is to very much in the beginning parts talk about philosophy around assessment in Ontario. And then we'll give you guys some examples as we're going through it and talking about how we do it and what it looks like in our classrooms. As we mentioned, we're both secondary English teachers, but we're very conscious a lot of people in the presentation here will be from across the K-12 space and a variety of different subject areas. So while we'll give you some concrete examples of what we've done, we really want to speak to things that will work in different ways for different people across the subject area. And so that's kind of our plan today. So I'm going to jump ahead here to the next slide. And so a key piece we focused on was playing around with the idea of a feedback cycle. We really focused on a variety of areas in the space, and at the core of it really tried to choose metacognition as a key selection, a key piece of that. So we looked at self and peer reflection in the space, and really, again, I hope most of you are probably familiar with metacognition, but if you're not, metacog really is a focus of the idea of how you look at your own learning and that self-reflective piece. And so once you've been through something, kind of stopping to reflect on what was the process like for me, how did the end result turn out, what went well, what didn't go well, and it's really a reflection on your own learning. And so keeping that in mind, it becomes, one piece I want to speak to that too was the research behind Metacog is actually super supportive and fantastic. But it's actually kind of pointed to as one of the key things for looking at improvement in students is that metacognition space and giving students time to think about and giving them the dialogue and the conversations and the even the terminology they need to look through that and do that in that self-reflective space themselves. So we really push self and peer reflection and really having them reflect on it and giving them some terminology and some vocabulary to work through that space themselves. And we found a lot of benefits there in looking at student assessment. So that was kind of a core central piece for us. And then on one side of that, I'd say is more the traditional model of what we look at assessments, and where probably most teachers, I say, feel very, very comfortable and being in that space. The idea of a summative project or a test, that standard assessment that most of us are very used to. You may have a feedback loop in that space, so thinking about how we give student feedback and ideas to improve. The idea of potentially for resubmissions, and also, again, the reflective piece there. And then on the flip side of that, moving away from the summative side, we also focus on the formative side with descriptive feedback. And really giving kind of like making a cyclical process for their students. I can give an example for us as English teachers. When it comes to writing, most of the times we'll have students go through a drafting process, submit their work to us, and we will look to give them feedback without giving them a mark tied to that. So we'll do the feedback piece and say, we're not putting a number on this, we're not putting a level on this. Here's the feedback we want you to go through in a formative space. Go back, take the feedback, improve your work, resubmit it to us, and that's when we get to a rubric and putting a more of a level and a mark onto it as well. So Jamie, anything to add to this space?
So yeah, we really focus a lot on the metacognition piece because it is in all 4 strands of our curriculum, and so we really wanted to make that a focus for our students to really think about that. Is that better in terms of sound for you guys, by the way? If you can let me know if it's better. I changed my mic around a bit while Andrew was talking, and so hopefully that's better for you. If you can let me know. It's definitely louder. Okay, I'm guessing that's a good thing. Yeah, so the idea of metacognition is huge for us, and not just perfect. Oh, so glad to hear that. Oh, good. It's not just in English, but it's in everything. I mean, if you look at some of the biggest thinkers in education, like John Dewey, for example, it's that you have to reflect on your thinking. And I was actually just saying to my colleagues today that one of the things that's really hard is that it's hard to get kids to buy into the idea of reflecting, because they really need to be thinking about that that's the best thing. That's how we learn. And so it's creating that culture as well within your classroom.
So I'll speak to this one. This is something I hear from my students all the time. You know, as I'm doing something in classroom, I'm introduce something, and we're going through a task in some ways, and I hear from my students all the time, is this being marked? And I have to say, as an educator, I hate this question. And really behind that is, because really what a student asks, is this being marked? Really what they're asking is this important? Do I need to worry about this? Do I need to care about it? And as a teacher who puts a lot of time into his lessons, I take that personally. You know, it's like, okay, you know, if I say no, this is not a formal mark that's tying into your report card comment, and then they're like, oh, okay, well, I don't really need to pay attention closely now. And so again, it's a really fascinating piece, and this is something I struggled with. And I'll say for myself, like, I've evolved greatly in my classroom, the way I look at assessment. So I went back a few years. I would say I do what I think as like most of my colleagues and a lot of teachers are doing, is that you would have an assessment plan for the semester. So say, okay, I have, like, you know, it might be, you break it into the types of assessments you have. So it might be the 20%, I'll do 20% of my overall mark will be for tests, 30% would be assessments or projects, and I'll have this over here, and the breakdown there. Or I might break it down assignment by assignment. So I might say, okay, I'm doing 3 paragraphs, I'll make them each worth 5% of the mark. I'll have an essay over here that's worth 10%. I'll have this reading test over here, which is this one's worth 7, this one's worth 8, and it plays into that space. But a problem with that is then, like, the students are aware of that, and we make them conscious of that, as they should be. But then it kind of puts in their minds, at least for a lot of our students, is that what's important versus not. Okay, what's this worth? If this is worth 10% of my mark or 15% of my mark, this is important for me. If this is worth 2 or 3% of my mark, this is not as important for me. Or if this is not being marked, if it's only formative, maybe I don't care about this as much anymore. And so we started off talking about the culture of our classrooms and how important that is. And this kind of plays into that space again. Now, one of the things that I've loved in making this adaptation into looking at the triangulation of data based off of Ontario, the Ministry's growing success, is the idea of observations and conversations. And so when students ask me that question now, I say, yeah, I'm always marking you. It's not just your sum of products, which is just one piece of that triangle in the triangulation of data. It's also the observations I make in the classroom, and it's also the conversations we have. So basically, I'm always assessing you, and basically everything you do in this classroom becomes a part of your assessment. And when it comes to, again, one of the things I love about the Ontario education, the way we look at assessments, is that, and sorry, Melanie, I see your mic's on there. Would you mind turning off, because we're getting some feedback from you on your end? Anyways, and sorry, one of the reasons I truly love looking at the triangulation of data is that I can say to my students all the time now, everything you do in this classroom is being assessed. And so if we sit down, we have a conversation one-on-one, or if I join a small group and we're having conversations, that's something I'm supposed to take into account when I'm assessing you now. And just even like when we're not talking, but just observing what you're doing, I'm also expected to make that part of my assessment practice with you. And then, yeah, it's a really interesting mind shift for me as an educator, and then also for my students as well. And it's an interesting space from talking with parents as well too, and how that plays out and what that looks like. And I know it can be a scary thing. I know it was a scary thing for me to make that shift as an educator. And like I said, it was interesting when Jamie and I were doing our research project on this last year, that we debated a lot, like, what does this look like and how we do this. We're not trying to create a ton of extra work for ourselves. And so this philosophically sounds great, but where does the workflow go? And so that's going to be kind of a key piece of this presentation tonight, is us talking around the philosophy, and then also talking about how we did that and how we made that look.
So Erin asked a question about she says she can't seem to get them to understand the importance of feedback and the revisions and resubmissions. So I'll tell you the truth is that when my students do a task, I don't actually give them the rubric back until they resubmit to me. And when we look at our English expectations, one of the expectations is revision, and that is a key overall expectation for the course. So we tell our students that we try to stay with them a little bit, because we tell them, if you don't actually resubmit your work, we can technically dock you marks for what we're doing, because you map system, the curriculum expectations, that, sure, and then for sure, you don't actually teach English. But withholding the rubric actually works really, really well, because I don't give them a mark. So they can maybe make an educated guess, but I don't necessarily give them back the rubric until they've resubmitted to me. And it's training them to think that way, that that's the focus on the learning, not on the grade. And so it maybe sounds cruel that maybe I'm withholding that, but it's evidence, and if they're not actually going to fulfill that, then that's a problem for them as well. And so, you can speak to the learning skills in there, that they're not focusing on responsibility and organization, because they're not actually doing what you've asked of them. And this is where, too, for me, I use Google Classroom, and so I know that other school boards use OneNote and whatever other learning management system you might be using. But for me, I ask my students to submit their work through Google Classroom. I put my feedback on it, and then I shoot it back to them. And I tell them, if you want your rubric back, you're going to have to resubmit to me. And if you don't want your rubric back, that's okay, but you're not going to actually know your grade. And so that's one of the things that I definitely do. I don't know if it's maybe because I'm a mom or what, if I use that kind of thinking with them. But in fact, that's what we've made as a policy within our department, is that the students don't get the rubric back until they actually resubmit the work for grades. And so at this point, we kind of wanted to open the floor a little bit to how you guys see the triangulation of assessment, what you're doing in your classrooms. We have lots of what we're doing, but we're Andrew and I are big time learners, and we love to hear what other people are doing. And to be completely honest, we're especially curious about what happens in elementary. I have a daughter in, sorry, that's my dog shaking in the background, but I have a daughter in grade 2, and I'm always so impressed with what she is bringing home and what her teacher is doing within the classroom. And so we wanted to give you guys the chance to add in what you guys do in the classroom. And so we're going to invite people to take the mic and go from there.
So with that in mind right now, again, if you want to raise a hand, if you have something to add, just looking at how you look at conversations, observations, or products in your classroom in that triangulation assessment, feel free to throw something in the chat and we can speak to it. And if your computer's set up with a microphone, feel free to jump on the mic right now too and just kind of take over and give us a quick share too. So we'd love to hear from some other people here of how they look at this right now and what they're doing with it. Let's see, any takers? Not seeing anything in the chat yet, and I'm not seeing any hands or even jumping under the mic. So again, just to clarify, if you're not sure how to use your mic, if you have a mic on your laptop, on the computer you're using, a lot of them have them built in the top left-hand corner there under your profile, above the main room for for people, essentially. There's a talk button there if you want to jump on. Or again, please feel free to share just in the chat as we're kind of discussing this here too, because we, again, really do enjoy hearing from other teachers to look at how they look at the idea of triangulation. And keep in mind too, this is a new space for us. We're very aware that people are just starting to play around with this idea. Cindy, so you're asking about triangulation. Okay, that's a really good question. And this is actually probably something that, again, hasn't been a focus in necessarily a ton of school boards there. It hasn't trickled down through it. And when we're looking at school boards or assessment evaluation policies. So when we're talking about triangulation of assessment, it's the 3 words you see on the screen there. So a document we're speaking to a lot tonight is the Ministry of Ontario's for Education, is the Growing Success document. And it was published in 2010. And it had a lot of great ideas about how we look at assessment education. And we're going to speak to a number of those tonight. But one of the key things it kind of mentioned is that when you're looking at assessment, teachers should look at triangulation. And what that means was we should be looking at products, we should be looking at the observations we have in our classroom, and also the conversations we have with our students. It was interesting they chose a triangle because it's not a hierarchy. It's 3 pieces that can be looked at when you're doing the assessment of your classrooms. And so what I would say is for most teachers, and I'd say the traditional method of education and what most of us are probably used to, is the idea of products. So when we look at products, yes, and so yes, definitely it's products, observations, and conversations. That's the idea of triangulation. So when it comes to assessment and say looking at a final mark in your classroom, you're supposed to, and the expectation from the Ministry of Education is that we're taking all 3 of those things into consideration. So again, just say a very simplistic view would say, and again, this wouldn't be good assessment practices, but say the only way you looked at assessment in your classroom was through tests. All you gave was tests. You're going to have some students who might be very strong students, but they're just not good test takers. It's the method of assessment that is holding them back from showing their learning. I know I can speak to this myself in a lot of ways. Again, as an English teacher, one of the ways that pops up for me in my classroom is I used to assess a ton of things through writing. I wasn't just assessing the writing skills through writing, I was also assessing their reading and comprehension and the conversation in the classroom, and I would have my students write that in that space to show me their, say, understanding of the text. Now, one thing that popped up with me for that is if my student's not a strong writer, it's very difficult for them to show their understanding of a text they've read. They may have really, really understood the text and had a deep understanding of it, but the task itself of my assessment, the product I was giving them, was a hindrance to them showing their learning. Whereas on the flip side, if I had sat down with that student and if they're a strong oral communicator, I have a 5-minute conversation with them, they might have given me very deep, insightful answers to the same questions on the test. And I definitely have had that play out in my classroom a number of times. And so, again, that I could take that conversation, even if a student struggled on a test, for example, if I had a great conversation where they showed me their learning, growing success is saying, hey, you should take that conversation into account when you're looking at assessing a student on the curriculum. And Cindy, I hope that kind of spoke to that kind of idea. And so that's really what we're talking about, this idea of conversations, observations, and products. And say, again, what I would look at is I think most teachers are very strong at the product side, and the shift, and this was definitely the case for Jamie and I, is looking at more of the conversations, observations. And I saw in the chat group earlier, someone was asking like, hey, it's very difficult to document those things and kind of come back to those. How do you do that? We're going to speak to it philosophically first, but later on in this presentation, we're also going to speak to concrete ideas of how we go about doing that in our classes and some ways to make that workflow pretty simple.
Okay, so in thinking about conversations, one of the things that we really try to do is we've restructured how we teach. And so in looking at that, I spend a lot of time not at the front of the classroom and more in the classroom with the students. And so, like, truthfully, we are hour-long classes at our school because we have MSIP, which is the multi-subject instructional period. So we have 5 periods a day as opposed to 4. And so what I really try to do is maximize those 60 minutes. And so I give a 5 or 10 minute spiel about what we're going to be doing that day. And if there's something like, if I want to tackle something as a whole class, I might take another 5 or 10 minutes there and talk about it with the group. But overall, a lot of my classes are spent where I'm in the class with the kids. And Andrew definitely does the same thing in terms of how we manage our classes. So we spend a lot more time with one-on-one with our students or in small group instruction. And it's really rethinking about how you're going to do that with your students. And so it's spreading out your content so that you have time to do that, but it's also thinking about, okay, that, you know what, there are some kids who are going to know the content right away and they're going to have a really good grasp of it. Those are the ones that you know you can structure your lessons that they can go and just do. Whereas the other ones that might need a little bit more hand-holding, you can structure so that you build in time to work with them. And so for us, conversations are a huge piece of really spending a lot of time talking to our students. And so that's something that I think is a big shift, you know, away from the stage on the stage to the guide on the side or whatever silly little phrase you want to use. But that's really truly how Andrew and I run our classrooms, is that it is structured that the first few minutes of class are to get everybody organized, to connect, maybe run a class discussion or do a quick lesson about something or something like that. But then it's really thinking about how you're planning your lesson so that you can then get in and have those good conversations with your students. And believe me, like, I have 3 classes right now, and 2 out of the 3 classes are like 30-ish kids. And so it's spending time really thinking about structuring that so that I'm able to spend that time with those students. The other thing is that for us, we spent a lot of time like experimenting. Part of our TLOP was really experimenting with technology to use that to our advantage. And so we use video quite often to record conversations. And whether it be that one thing we did was that we had students spend time talking in front of the class. So they did an oral presentation, and then we recorded the oral presentation where I asked them questions back and forth. And so then that's documentation of a conversation. Or whether we're having kids document their own conversations that they're having. We really spend a lot of time thinking about how can we leverage technology in this area, because that's, like, we have that at we have those abilities. And thankfully TLOP allowed us to experiment with that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just, like, there's some great chat going on, by the way, and thank you all for sharing your own ideas about looking at observation and conversations and the documentation piece. And we're just going to get into that piece of the presentation ourselves. So I'm glad you guys are asking questions that we're hoping to answer for you soon and can give you our workflow with that. And I think it's a really important conversation, and this was my space too. I thought some of the most powerful stuff was me having one-on-one conversations with my students. But also appreciate as a teacher, it's very, very difficult to find time in your classroom when you have 25 or 30 students there for those one-on-one conversations. And that's a whole other different philosophical conversation. And so while I think I can speak for Jamie here, both her and I try to create space in our classrooms to do that, it's not really feasible on the day-to-day. And so one thing we said was like, well, how do we, and I guess also something like how is talking about student-led documentation of observations and conversations. And it's creating spaces for students to create something or share something with you that you can look at asynchronously with them. So if it's not just running class time, but it's like prep or outside the class or marking, is having students create little products or reflections or little like one-on-one conversations, or just recording their own reflections on something to share with you that you can look at after the fact. And so we're going to speak to some spaces around that. So as Jamie mentioned, like, using video is great in one way. If you have, again, it could just be your phone or an iPad, or if your school has Chromebooks, there are so many ways now to leverage technology in fantastic and phenomenal ways to create and document observations and conversations in your classroom. So video is one idea. We're very fortunate, and again, I know this is in the space for all school boards, but the Waterloo Region District School Board, if you're not aware, for the past 2 years now for all our schools, and for the past 3 years for a few pilot schools, every grade 9 student on the first day of school has been given a Chromebook from the school board, and they have it with them, and they keep it with them for the day, and it goes home with them at night, and they keep it for the school year. So we're very fortunate. We realize this is not the case for everybody, but at our high school, from grades 9 to 11, every student has a Chromebook that's theirs to keep and use. And across the school board for all of Waterloo Region, every student grade 9 and grade 10 has that space. So in a year or two for us, like, every student in high school will have their own device to carry around with them. And yeah, we're very fortunate. And so something we'll speak to is like giving students opportunities to use their devices in that way. And again, realize I got a secondary space too. We'll speak to a little bit about, like, truth be told, a lot of students do now have cell phones, and they are really powerful tools to kind of share things back and forth. But even on your own space as a teacher, looking to leverage some of those tools just in your classroom to kind of create spaces for share that as well. So video is one great option. We're going to head off to the next slide here, and then speak to specifically observations here. And so we talked to video a bit, and we're going to come to conversations and observations. When it comes to observations, this is a really new space for me as a teacher too, is thinking about, I was very much in the sense of like, well, I have my products and what my students hand in to me, and that's how I'm going to assess them. And we heard the terminology, like, as a teacher, you're supposed to use your professional judgment. When it comes to assessments, use your professional judgment. And truthfully, like, I feel so fortunate to be an educator in Ontario, because that is the message. It's like that idea of, it's your classroom and you know your students better than else. And when it comes to assessments and grades and levels and marks, you should be using everything at your disposal to come up with that idea. And it's not just a number on a test or an assignment or a final mark because of weightings in a grade book, but there are a whole bunch of things that go into that. And so the observations you make in your classroom are very important. And like I said, I think it overlaps with conversations here a bit too, but just walking through my classroom sometimes when my students are working on something and stopping to have a quick conversation with the student, and if they share something really insightful to me, say about a unit we're studying in class, that might be something that I go and make it as an observation. So for me, that might be grabbing a notebook and writing down very quickly to come back to later on a student, or popping onto my phone and making a quick note in my notepad about that student. And again, we're going to talk about some features and tools later on in this presentation towards the end. Jamie and I kind of said one tool for ourselves that we love using, but at the same time, I think we're both kind of like tool agnostic. It doesn't really matter what tool you're using. There's so many different hacks around that, but really the idea of like how you find some easy workflow for yourself to quickly and easily document your observations of your classroom and how you're looking at your students in that way.
The other thing that's really, really important about this is it's really about training your students to think about assessment this way. And so at secondary, for a lot of them, they really think that when they demonstrate their learning, it's through the essay, the test, the project, whatever. But they don't realize that it's so much more than that. And so what you see here is a screenshot of something I wrote to my students a couple months ago about a task that they did in class. And what I asked them to do was I asked them to read a book of their choosing, because we were part of our TLP also was honoring student voice and choice. And this was at the 4U level, grade 12 university level. I asked them to read a book. It had to be grade appropriate. I was looking at actually the target audience being an adult learner, but they had to read a book of their choosing. And then instead of actually using that as a summative task, I used it as an observation, because I asked them, there was a whole bunch of learning goals and success criteria revolving around it, but I didn't give them a rubric. And what I did actually incorporate it as was an observation of their work. And so, but in order to do that, and in order for students to buy into the process, I needed to make it very explicit to them that this was not a grade per se, and that it was an observation, and that it's teaching them the lingo that goes with it, that they need to know that an observation is just as valid as a product. And the conversation you have with me is going to be honored as much as the product is going to be honored with me, because you can learn, you can hear different things, and they can meet the expectations in very different ways. And so what I wanted them to know was that they communicated that in writing, and I wanted to tell them, and that some of them actually did a way better job in that context, and therefore I actually have improved their writing mark because of that demonstration of learning. And so the students need to know that this is a really valid form of assessment, because so many of them think that the only way they get assessed is by a product that gets averaged throughout the course of the semester. And so that is the old way of thinking, and that's not been true for a really long time. And so that's really important. Okay, interesting. Do you ever get parent pushback about this? To be honest, I never have, because for many of the students, I don't know that any student that this isn't a benefit for, because this is me using my professional judgment on a day-to-day basis based on what that student does every day in my classroom. And it's me honoring them and honoring their learning and their intelligence and whatever else you want to incorporate into that. I've never had a parent push back on it, because most of the time it actually only benefits them. And that's part of the reason, like I say to my students, it's so important that you come to class every single day, because I'm giving you the chance to get that feedback from me on a day-to-day, descriptive feedback on a day-to-day basis based on the conversation that we might have. But it also shows me what your true skills are. If that on that day that on that essay that you wrote for me, that you weren't exactly clear on what you were trying to communicate, but I saw it in a different context, or whatever you read didn't come through clearly on one day, but the next day I saw that you actually did have a really good understanding of it, and then you were able to show me deep learning by transferring it to a different context. And so by giving them the tools to understand what we're doing, because there's so many times that I think students don't actually know what we're doing as teachers. Something that we didn't actually incorporate into our presentation is that on all our assessments, Andrew and I put the actual curriculum expectations on all of our assessment tasks. And so the students, on a very regular basis, we talk about what is the actual curriculum? Like, we show them the website that they can go to look up what the actual curriculum expectations are, because we want to be very transparent in that for students to know, because I don't think that they necessarily really believe that. And they don't know what we're actually assessing them on in many cases, which is, it's really hard to actually meet expectations when you don't know, other than by having the learning goals and success criteria, obviously, but where does that come from?
Yeah, so I'm just going to speak to the chat a little bit here. So a few things. Robert asked the question, like, do your observation and conversation turn into some sort of mark? And I would say yes in a few ways. Sometimes it is formal for us, as we're going to, we'll create an observation or a conversation space with students to make that a formal mark. But I would say, and more kind of what Jamie was speaking to, this also I think ties into Megan's question about do you get parent pushback from this, or we're going to start asking questions like, would students push back on this? And I kind of jumped in the chat and agree with what Jamie was saying here too, is that I've never had observations or conversations be a detriment to a student's mark. It's only been beneficial. And I think like the big push personally when I work at growing success and kind of these industry guidelines is that when we're talking about making observations and conversations part of our assessment practice when we look at grades, it's just different opportunities for students to show their learning. And when I look at it like from a product standpoint, and again, we can look at it like it can be a test, it can be a project-based assignment, it could be an exam, it could be a lab report, it could be a math quiz, whatever it is you're looking at. A lot of times with students, it's just, that's one format for a way the students to show their learning. If they struggle with that specific format in that time, it may not be that they actually don't understand the curriculum or what you're actually trying to have demonstrate to you for their learning. It might be the task just for that particular student that's getting in the way. And so when I look at observations and conversations myself, it's just different opportunities for our students to show us that they actually have learned the curriculum we're trying to get at. So it's not, we're not looking at how good are you at taking a test, or how good are you at creating a lab, or how good are you doing this quiz in this math formula. It ties into, okay, if that format didn't work for you to show your learning, there are other ways for you to demonstrate that. And if you show me in a different way, that is still you showing me the curriculum and the expectations I'm looking for in the class, that is something I should consider, and not just say, well, you're giving me a great answer right now as we're talking about this, but you know what, you bombed the test, so sorry, that's the mark that matters. Okay, so we're going to slide ahead here with the slides. And so we just want to talk about some examples here. And so one way we've kind of created a space for students to kind of have an asynchronous conversation, or to create a documented observational conversation for us, is for students to record audio reflections. And again, we have our Chromebooks in our classrooms, but it could be through a phone, or it could be even just if you have one device in your classroom, is setting up a little space or booth for students to go and do recordings for you and submit it to you. And then documenting this in an LMS somewhere. So for Jamie and I, we use Google Classroom. It's a very common tool across many school boards now. If you're Google Classroom Education School Board, for some people it might be using Desire to Learn, or if you're in the e-learning space. I know some school boards use EDSB. Whatever it is, there's some space for students to easily kind of create things and share them with you. And so audio recordings has been something we've really added to our classrooms in a great way in the past year or two. And it's been phenomenal ways for have students getting a chance to openly talk about, reflect on their learning, and share it with you. And from an assessment standpoint, it is really amazing too, because I'd say it's actually pretty quick. For me as an English teacher, again, instead of sometimes reading through a paragraph or an essay or a really long piece of writing, just giving students a chance to talk about their learning and reflect on what they're going through and sharing their understanding to me, it's sometimes only a 1 or 2 minute recording. And I've got a rubric out there, so when it comes to an assessment standpoint outside of the space of the classroom, I can play the recording of them talking about what I want them to document, and have that rubric out and kind of go through the assessments, make some comments, and have it back to the students. So the idea of using audio recordings is giving a chance for students to share through an oral communication standpoint their thinking and their learning, having them record that, and then for you essentially going back and listening to that conversation has been a really powerful example in our classrooms of kind of looking at that and creating a space for students to maybe create that own conversation outside the classroom for a faculty to kind of come back later. Another thing we're looking at is just kind of taking notes by hand. And I know a lot of people have been commenting in the chat talking about well, these are all great, I do these things, but how do I actually create a space for myself to track those? If I write down things in a handbook, when it comes to reporting time for a final mark of my class, that's not great, because how do I find that? We are going to get to the actual tools later on and speak to it. We didn't want this to be tool focused, and just working with OTF too, they didn't want us to be tool focused and focus more on the pedagogy here. But that being said, we realize they go hand in hand. So we're going to speak to a lot in the beginning of the presentation here of the philosophy and pedagogy around it, and then we'll get to some specific tools down the line. That being said, here I'll pass over to Jamie to talk about how she uses hand-taking of notes.
So what you'll see here, this is a screenshot from my iPad Pro. So I love to write by hand. I love technology, but I love to write by hand, even though it's probably hard to read my handwriting. As everybody tells me, it's hard to read my handwriting, but I can read it myself. So in the iPad Pro, what I'm actually using here is just the Notes app. And you will see later on what we do with this and how I put it into and tag off my students. But this is me just sitting down with some students actually last week, and this is me listening to their conversation and making an observation of their learning. And so I was able to pull out these details that they were talking about and what the things I was looking for, and I had given them in advance, like things that I wanted to hear from them, and that they were actually just having an organic conversation about what they had read. And so I was able then to pull these details out. And the iPad Pro, for those of you who have the chance to use one, is a phenomenal tool in terms of that. But personally, I love taking notes by hand. I've always been that kind of a person, even though it can be challenging to read my handwriting. But it gives me the chance to still, I feel like, engage in active listening strategies, and that gives the chance for me to not be tied behind the computer when I'm taking these notes. But I mean, to each their own. The other thing too is that this works for me in terms of my workflow, but this might not work for you. And truly, one of the things you have to think about is what is actually going to work for you within your own personal workflow, because I think that's the important piece, is that you have to be comfortable with what's going to work for you.
So I can say for myself that handwriting is not my thing, and I didn't find a good space for that as well, which is great doing. Like Jamie did a lot of co-teaching last year at the TLP, and so while that worked for her, it wasn't a space for me at all. And so like using some kind of LMS, again, if it's just Google Classroom, something along those lines, we'll speak to some tools again later. But even just having something very quickly to type notes out. And so this is like just a documentation I made actually during summative time. I gave my, and I just see Linda there asking LMS. LMS stands for Learning Management System. Google Classroom would be an example of an LMS. The provincially purchased Desire to Learn would be the learning management system. Some people use things like Seesaw, Edmodo. There's a ton of tools out there that kind of tie into that LMS space. So it's basically just an online platform for you to share space and document things with your students. So again, Google Classroom is a great example. So this note here is just, I gave a reading sum to my students. They had options of some articles to read, and then we sat down and had a conversation, and they gave me their analysis of it. And so as I kind of let them take the things, like here's my expectations, here's what I want you to document, here's what I want you to show me. I gave them a list of questions to answer like I would on a test. So instead of having them handwrite their answers, they got to speak through it. And so I had to document that. So instead of them handwriting on a test or kind of completing a test online, they were talking through the space. And so while they're doing that, I just sat there and I was kind of typing away and making my observations about what they're saying and commenting on the quality of their answers, just like I would on the test. Like if they wrote a hand answer on it, I might say, okay, this is level 3, this is level 2, this is level 4+. But here I am documenting this. And this is like, so here's a note that I can come back to as an observation of my students' learning that I'm also tying a mark onto. I mean, in many ways, too, my observations also become my feedback to my students because I'm documenting what they're doing well at and what they're struggling with and kind of where they're missing the mark. And so while I'm attaching a mark to that, it also kind of becomes their feedback as well. So there's an example there of kind of typing it out versus handwriting. And moving ahead, another example, again, a lot of school boards have gone Google Apps for Education or the G Suite for Education. And so another thing that's become very common is just creating a standard Google form and looking at ways to document things very quickly on a phone, on an iPad, or a computer in your classroom. And Jamie's done actually a lot more with this in my space, so I'm going to pass it back to her to kind of speak to how she's used Google Forms as a way of documenting things in her classroom.
So one thing that's been really important for me is to play in this situation and to scaffold my own learning. Sometimes I think teachers get overwhelmed because there's so many tools out there and there's so many ways and so many ideas and amazing things that are happening in the world that we can incorporate into our classroom. But it's really thinking about what works the best for you, and experimenting and playing is okay. And so truthfully, I used the Google form last year more so than I do this year. And it's because I found that it could be, I found it cumbersome, to be honest. But for some people, this might be a really good means of tracking observations. So I wanted to include it into our presentation because it's something that might work for somebody. And so for this, what it is here is that I devised a form where I had the student's name. I had all of their names. So it's a drop-down menu so you could pick the actual name of the student. And then I wanted to give an observation of a learning skill or one of the 4 strands of our curriculum. And so what I was doing with it was I was actually using voice to text in my observations because I'm a decently fast texter. I can record things fairly enough, but I talk faster than I type. And so in thinking about time, and I was using this a lot too at the end of the period, where I had a few minutes, where I was on prep, I had a few minutes to think back on my class and make a couple of observations. And so I was using voice to text, and then I was submitting it. One thing, there's some really great, yes, doc appender, bingo. There are some really great extensions out there that allow you to then send all of those interesting observations that you've made to a document that you can share back with your students. And so one of the things I did with some students was that when I conferenced with them one-on-one, I might use this as a documentation tool to then shoot it back to them. So then I had set up the form in advance with their name. I made the observation, and then I had set it up with each student had their own document, and then I had individually shared each document with each student so that when I made that observation, it automatically populated their document. So it might say, so if a student was regularly checking that document, they would say, oh, Ms. Rayburn made that observation for me. And it was, Dr. Pendera there's great tutorials online on YouTube if you're curious about it. It's fantastic in terms of a reflection metacognition aspect. Thank you, Lauren, for adding that, because absolutely they can add that as well. But it was an interesting way for me to document the learning process and share it easily with the students. And so Heidi Manhart in our board is a phenomenal Google Forms guru. The woman is amazing with what she can do with a Google form, and I have to give her a shout out because she's a master of the Google form, and she has done a ton of really interesting things with that piece alone. But even doing something simple like having a voice to text Google form. The other thing too you can do is that if you're using an iPad or your phone or whatever, you can make it as part of your home screen that you just touch that and it automatically links, and you don't actually have to go through Safari, for example. You can actually just use it right straight from your home screen on your phone, make those observations, and then record it. The other piece for me that didn't work out well, as many of you probably have gathered, is that I have a crazy quiet voice, and so the voice to texting didn't necessarily work the best for me because of that. And so you have to be conscious of that piece as well, because eventually it ended up getting too frustrating for me. So I went back to using the handwriting documentation because I found it worked the best for me. But you just have to play and figure out what's exactly going to work the best for you.
Okay, so one thing I'm going to kind of shift a little bit here away from observations and conversations, which we want to make a very big focus for this. And again, we'll get to some tools later on for how we kind of look at how we try to manage this. There's lots of options out there. But we want to shift now to something else that kind of came regarding success that was a really interesting philosophical shift for us. And again, an interesting change from maybe how a lot of teachers look at assessment in their classrooms that came from growing success. And it's actually worth reading this quotation we put down here. So right over growing success, it says, we're looking at the idea of most recent and most consistent work for students is that determining a report card grade will involve teachers' professional judgment and interpretation of evidence and should reflect the student's most consistent level of achievement, with special consideration given to more recent evidence. And this was really powerful for me and really kind of stood out to me when I looked at my practice and how I assess my students, because when I talk about weightings here in a little set, like traditionally how I used to set my grade book was I would say I'd look at all my assessments from a semester or a school year. I would say, okay, I'd put weightings, so it's like, okay, this is worth 5%, this is worth 7%, this is worth 10%, and those would just be numbers I would create on the spot before the school year started, before I met my students, and I would stick to that, and that was my plan. And so I go through and I put my students, and they do the test, they do my essays, they do my assignments, and I would pop the numbers in, and then my assessment tool for my board, Markboard, would pop a number back to me and say, okay, here's your kid's final number. And so I worked in that space for a long time, but I started thinking about it, and after reading this kind of quotation from Growing Success, it really had a powerful impact on me. And so I'll give you an example. So I might have my students write 3 paragraphs in a semester. So really I'm looking at the same skill from the curriculum all 3 times. And so I might say, well, they're all paragraphs, so I'll make them worth 5% each at the final mark. So my students show up in September, write a paragraph in September, and start of the school year, so they get a 60 on it. And then I give another one a month and a half later. And so in the second one, my students get a student gets a 70 on it, and then they have a third one at the end of the year, and they get an 80 on it. And so I've got 3 paragraphs there, and I've got 3 marks, so 60, 70, and 80. Now, if I weight those as all 5%, that spits out a mark of, when it comes to writing a paragraph, the student is a 70 level student based on the averages there and how I create my weightings. But what this is really saying from Growing Success is the idea of most recent, most consistent is, well, you know what, the student developed and got better and learned throughout the semester, like duh, just like we want our students to do. And really, when I'm looking at my mark book and how I set up my weightings, is like I'm penalizing my students for where they were in September and October and not taking into account where they really are with their skills and how they've improved at the end of the semester. And so what this is really saying is final mark for your students should really be a reflection of where they are at the end of the school year or the semester, and not the beginning. And so when I look at that 60, that 70, that 80 at the end of the semester, I'm going to say, well, when it comes to the skill of writing a paragraph, maybe my students are actually like that student's a high 70 or an 80 level student, because that's where they finished the semester off, and that's their most recent work. And so how do we account for those things? And so that's sort of what Growing Success is asking us to do, which is a really interesting space with how we look at our assessments, how we tie into that. So moving ahead here, I think a key piece that's tied to this, and we're looking at that, is this idea of spiraling your curriculum. If you're not familiar with the term of spiraling, essentially what it's saying is, like, depending on what you're teaching, is not just breaking things into units where you move throughout the semester. Okay, we're going to learn this, and I'll teach you this, I'll give you a test on it, and we're going to move on. I'm never going to come back to that again. And we're on to this next unit. In science, it might be, you start off with ecology. And so I'll teach you ecology for 3 weeks, and I'll give you a test on ecology, and then we're never going to speak about ecology again. And then I'll go on to chemistry and then biology. But we're only going to touch on them once. There might be 1 or 2 assessments tied to it, and then we'll never come back to it until it's like the end of the semester of the school year. In mathematics, again, we're very structured, kind of building units that way. And so the idea of spiraling is getting out of that unit mentality and teaching to something once and then moving on for never coming back to it. And spiraling is kind of moving through things multiple times. You will move at a quicker pace, you attempt something, you leave it, you go on to something else, but knowing for you and your students you're going to come back to it again. And this really opens the door for the opportunity for multiple opportunities for your students to improve throughout the semester and show you the learning and how it's improved. Now, some of you there, I'm probably sure, are saying, well, like screaming at the wall, that might be easy for you as an English teacher because, you know what, you're just looking at the skill of like writing and reading. It's easy to kind of keep coming back to that over and over. And I will 100% agree with you. As an English teacher, our curriculum is very much set up to spiral the curriculum, and that kind of just happens by default in our classrooms. But I do want to say there's been a lot of research into spiraling and how great and how effective it is for student learning. And with that being said, some people have done some really phenomenal things in the space of looking at how you can spiral in a math classroom or a science classroom across subjects and the power it's had on their students. So the video that you can see a screenshot of there is actually of a former principal, and she's now working at a school board in Waterloo Region now. Her name is Kristen Phillips. And she gave a TED Talk at TEDx Kitchen and talking about spiraling the curriculum in the math classroom. And so Trish, thank you for dropping that link in there. We're not going to take the time to watch it now, but if you're interested in how you can spiral outside of in other classrooms like math or science, Kristen gives a phenomenal talk about how that's done, how she's done it in schools, the effect it's had on students. And I know personally, like in our board, she actually did this a lot of work with the grade 9 applied classrooms for mathematics in our school board. And we actually, that was the space we saw a giant significant growth in our EKO scores this past year, and a lot of the point too is just because they started spying quickly in the math classroom. So I want to say it can be done in lots of spaces in different subject areas, and it can be a very powerful way, and then that makes that space much easier for looking at most recent, most consistent work from your students as you evolve throughout the semester.
So at this point, we really wanted to give you guys the chance to engage in our conversation here. Andrew and I are big on conversations. If you're ever in our English office at lunchtime, it is a giant conversation happening every day. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to throw it out to you guys to talk about, like, what are we actually assessing? And what are we looking at the types of assessments? Because if you look at a lot of learning management systems, they're set up to default assess based on tests, quizzes, projects, that kind of thing. Are we assessing on skills? Are we assessing on overall expectations? And we wanted to see what other people are doing because, as I said before, we are really big into, we want to know what other people are doing because by no means do we think that we are experts in this. We are very happy to experiment and share. But we'd love to know what other people are thinking as well. So if you want to add to the chat, or if you want to put your hand up and add to the conversation, we'd love to hear from you guys as well.
And also to add to that too, we're saying this without any judgment or bias. It's actually fascinating to me talking to educators across the province because school boards look at board success and their own assessment and evaluation policies in so many different ways. And I like looking at this idea of types of assessments versus skills versus overall expectations. I have involved in that in so many different ways and tried so many different things. So again, as Jamie said, we'd love to just open the floor for a few minutes here to have some people share, like when they're thinking about assessments and looking at putting, like an example, a gradebook or markbook together, what is it that when you think of assessment, what is it that you look at? What is it your board's directing you to do, or how do you look at it personally in your classroom? And what is that like in your space? So if anyone wants to jump into the chat or again, jump on the mic and kind of share verbally, we'd love to hear from you and just kind of create a conversation on that here for a few minutes. So again, please feel free to raise a hand for the chat or just jump on the mic if you have one or share something to chat with us. When you're looking at assessment, what is the focus for you and what are you assessing on? Okay, you guys were doing so great before. The chat was flying around, and now it seems pretty quiet. So no one wants to take the dive there. So I guess I'll share a little bit for myself. I can say for myself, I was speaking a little bit there. Like I used to, a focus for me was on assessments themselves. So I'd say, okay, this paragraph is worth 5% of the overall mark. This reading test is going to be worth 8% of the final mark. This presentation by students is going to be worth 10% of their mark. And so I was very much focused on the products themselves, and that's the way I was assessing. And if someone's to share there with the expectations, that's great. And so I would say that's actually been a shift for me, and part of our TLP research project class was making a shift to the specific expectations. And so for Jamie and I, we looked at the English curriculum and decided to look at the overall expectations. So in English, we have 4 strands, and it's writing, reading, media studies, and oral communication. And we actually started assessing on the overall expectations and tracking by the overall expectations. And again, we'll talk about our workflow a little bit later in the student's presentation actually, and look to that. And I know some boards, again, our directions from our board was actually to try and cluster the overall expectations for a bit. So we're saying, like, look at your overalls. If you have 14, see if you can maybe blend that down into 8 or 10 and see if you can blend them in some way. Whereas I know other boards focus on KICA. And so the idea is like you do your weightings based off, okay, thinking is worth 30% of the assessment, communication is worth 40%, application is worth so much. And so it's another space too. And so we're in this interesting space in Ontario where we have the Ministry of Education give us direction say through growing success, but not laying down specific guidelines. It's board to board. So Lauren, I see you saying that you assess OE, but would like to teach more using skills as focus for the curriculum. Yeah, and the learning skills are very interesting too. And like, do we assess on the learning skills? We give students a breakdown on learning skills, and we talk about learning skills, but do we formally assess them? That's another really interesting question too. Do we give feedback very much on learning skills, or is this something that we put on our report cards? So absolutely. Okay, I do want to be conscious of time. We're already past the hour point, so I'm going to move ahead with this, and thank you for those of you who did jump in and share there. And so the last piece, and kind of spoken this a little bit already, is just a quick reflection on the idea of when we think about weightings, what are we really doing? And then we think about, again, okay, so hey, this sounds great. If I'm going to think about observations and conversations and make that a part of my products, and if I got to take into mind the idea of the most recent and consistent, how does that play out in how you weight things in your classroom? And I don't think there's not a specific direction around this, and there's not a right or wrong, and I can't sit here and tell you the way you should be doing your classroom. But I think it is very important to kind of stop here and think with everything we've talked about tonight and the idea of triangulation of data and everything else along with it, is how do our ratings fit into that? So if I start off the semester and weight something one in some way, does it have to be the end of that semester? Or does the weighting need to be the same for every student throughout? Again, if we're talking about most recent consistent, for some students, it might be the removal of a mark just for that student, but keeping it for the other 29 students in your classroom, based on the scenario they're going through. And again, when you look at weightings, are you focusing on the overall expectations? Are you focusing on the strands in your curriculum? Are they all equal? And I realize I'm throwing a lot of questions at all of you here. And again, I don't think there's a specific right answer to that. Again, I can say for myself and what I settle in my classroom is that I look at treating all 4 strands equally. So when I do my breakdown for my classroom, I look at the term mark being 70% and the 7 mark being 30. And as I said, we've got the 4 overall expectations in English. So I break that 70 down into 4 parts. And so I go 17.5 for each of those as up to 70. And then when I look at summatives, I look to assess on all 4 strands of summatives, and those are 7.5 each. And yeah, I'm sorry, Joe, you're asking about KICA there. Yeah, and thank you, Lauren, for sharing. So if you look at the Ontario curriculum, they give us a breakdown saying like all of our assessments should in some way look to focus on KICA. So you're looking at the knowledge of your students, what knowledge they gain in your class. You're looking at their inquiry and thinking, as was mentioned there. You're looking at assessing how they communicate and how effective they are at communication. And then also looking at how they apply their knowledge. And so that plays into how students make connections. And so the directions from Ontario and all of our curriculum documents across all subject areas is the idea that your assessment should keep KICA in mind. And again, board by board, interpretations can be very different there. While it's mentioned in the Ontario curriculum, some people assess and do their weightings based on KICA. Some people do it on the overall expectations. Lots of teachers do it by their specific assessments. And again, not a right or wrong. We just want to kind of highlight and throw a lot of questions at you and have you thinking about how can you do that. Okay, I'm just going to jump ahead here because we do want to get through this. And so one thing I can mention for like Gina, what we settled on is when we're looking at observation and conversation, is we're looking at the feedback loop and looking at the things we've been talking tonight, like metacognition and student reflections and things like that. This sounds like a ton of work. And like I said at the start of the conversation, one of the things for me is like I like trying to be as on top of what innovations in education are and what we're doing in the classroom, but I only have so many hours in the day, and you need to find a good work-life balance. And so one thing that we settled on is doing fewer formal summative tasks with our students, and then open it by creating more time in our classroom by removing more, like getting rid of a few summative tasks. That creates more space to look at observations and conversations and trying to document those things. So we're adding those things in. We're not doing necessarily more work. And we're looking at the feedback loop. So I mentioned that like that 3-paragraph example. That used to be like 5 paragraphs for me. Like if I went back 6 or 7 years in my practice, I was probably doing like 5 or 6 paragraph assignments a semester. Now I'm looking at doing 2 or 3 a semester with my students and looking at that feedback loop from them. I find it's more rich for my students. They're getting better feedback from me. They're getting different chances to opportunities to show their learning. And I would say the work level for me else is relatively similar and the same. So something to keep in mind there as well.
One of the things we also too really wanted to focus on is getting away from the idea of averaging, and because it speaks to the idea of most recent, most consistent, is that hopefully over the course of the semester your students are learning and they're growing and their skills are getting better, and so it's really not fair pedagogically to average that, because you're negating the learning that seems to be happening throughout the semester. And so we really spent a lot of time thinking about how do we get away from the idea of averaging. We wanted to really think about, okay, that we're going to focus a lot on looking at what the students are doing now. And so in secondary we have our midterm report card in November. And students say to me, oh my gosh, Ms. Rayburn, my mark was 60 on the report card in November. I'm still not going to get the mark that I want to get in your course by the end of the semester. And they say, don't worry about it. You know what? You I'm looking at how are your skills improving throughout the semester. And so for many of the students, it's really thinking about, and retraining them too, to think about that, you know what, you have multiple chances to demonstrate the learning. And so moving away from the idea of averaging really allows you to do that.
Okay, so we've talked very much here about the philosophy around what we're doing and, like, again, our interpretation of growing success. And we give you some ideas and examples of kind of different ways to look at documenting observations, conversations, and talking about that. And throughout this, a number of you asked, well, okay, that all sounds great. Excuse me, but what does it look like, or how do you do this? Like, I mean, okay, and this was us too. And again, I gotta say this, like, when we put in the research proposal for our TLP project, kind of where we did a lot of this work, we all thought this sounded great, but we weren't sure how to do it. We found ourselves like working way too many hours, and so a big focus for us was like, these things sound great, but how do we actually look at this and make this practice without killing ourselves and, you know, trying to leave some time to sleep at night? And so we kind of want to shift this kind of presentation over to now and looking at the more practical side of what does this look like for us. We looked at a variety of tools and a variety of different spaces to kind of manage. We'll speak to a few of those in a sec. But then we also settled on one. And again, we don't see one tool being as better than you. You have to really take into account a variety of things like your school board's policies, what tools are available to you, what's available to your students. But we did want to give you some concrete examples of how we did this to kind of make this workflow very easier for ourselves too. So one there is just Google Classroom. A lot of school boards is a free tool. A lot of school boards have Google Apps for Education, or what they call the G Suite for Education now. And it's phenomenally powerful in a way to share things with students, manage data, collect assessments from students. I can say for me, my own workflow is all my assessments are pushed out through Google Classroom by students, and that's where I track. And again, I think you really take consideration here, age level of your students, the grades working at, the access to tools. Do you have reliable Wi-Fi in your school? I've realized that there's a ton of questions that's different across K-12, across subject areas, across school boards. But again, we're going to give you some ideas and some space in that area, kind of playing with that too here. So Google Classroom has been a phenomenal tool for us in that space when it comes to the idea of pushing our assessments and sharing things with students. And before we get too deeply into looking at some of the tools here, one thing we want to speak into was the idea of data and privacy. And this is very rightfully so a large area of concern, and there's a lot of discussion around the space in education right now. And so one thing you're going to want to look at before we go into any of this and kind of go further with this is, like, for your own standpoint and protecting yourself and protecting your students, you're going to want to look at and looking at your board's privacy policies and looking at what does your board say about how you use student privacy and data, and also the use of educational technology tools. I also know the Ontario College of Teachers just last week, pushed out an updated version of recommendations for teachers for how they interact in the idea of in the space of social media and using student data and things like that too. So it's really worth working into that. Again, every school board is different, handling it differently. I can say in our school board, we've had a memo come out last year, kind of down like, okay, here's some things to look at. If you're going to look to use technological tools with your students and have students create accounts, you need to look at the user policy and, like, what is it saying and how is the data being used and where is it being housed. These are all very complicated questions, and again, it's board to board. It's a very fascinating, interesting space right now, but these are things we want you all to be aware of and kind of considering when you're looking at educational technology tools.
So we wanted to provide you guys with some links and some videos for those, some other tools that are, we think, really, really good tools. FreshGrade, Seesaw, Sesame, some of you are maybe familiar with these. They're very common ones that have been really well reviewed. We looked at all of them, and truthfully, like, they are amazing tools, and they all have very strong pros and cons for both of them, or for all of them. For us, they just didn't hit the mark for what we wanted to do, but we wanted to give you guys the opportunity that these are out there. They're free, but definitely make sure that you check your board's privacy policy before you engage in them, just so that you are covered as well and making sure that you're adhering to your board's procedures. But they are great, phenomenal tools that are available to you.
And with that being said, when we were looking at in our space and looking at for a variety of tools, like what we want to use. Jamie said we looked at essentially, like those were three we found that are very popular across education in Ontario and Canada. But we actually settled on a different one that kind of met the needs of all the things we've been talking about today. And the tool we focus on is from a company called Chalk.com called Markboard. I'm curious too, I've actually run some presentations for OTF Connects before about Planboard, which is an online lesson planning tool. And so Markboard is a sister tool. Out of curiosity, just by kind of pulling the Google room again, if you give me a green check mark or red X, who here is at least familiar with Chalk.com, Planboard, or Markboard? So you can give me a check mark familiar with it, red X if you're not familiar with it. Okay, coming in there about half and half or so. Okay. So again, this is a tool we're going to speak to just because it's one we settled on. Again, you need to look at a whole bunch of things, and again, I wouldn't say there's one right tool out there. Just like based on all the things we talked about tonight and what we looked at, this is what we found was the best tool for us. And we really want to focus on the philosophical and pedagogical side tonight, but at the same time, we wanted to leave you with a potential tool that you could walk away and say, okay, that's all the stuff you said tonight is great. How do we do that? This is the one that we settled on. So Chalk.com is a Ontario-based company. They're actually housed here. They're a local company for us in Waterloo region. I can tell you that we did not choose them at all based off of that. This just actually worked out that the tool that we like the most happened to be a local tool here. And if you're interested in Planboard, which is an online lesson planning tool, the Ontario Teachers Federation, who's running OTF Connects for us tonight, actually did a partnership with this company to create lesson plans and share lesson plans for teachers. So they have a great online lesson planning tool called Planboard, and Markboard, which you're speaking to tonight, is a sister tool, and like the two talk to each other. So if any of you are Planboard users and have a Planboard account, you may not even realize it, but you actually have a Markboard account as well, and they just work together, and you can kind of jump back and forth between the two. So for the last 10, 15 minutes of this tonight in the conversation here, we want to show you how to use Markboard to easily manage kind of everything we've been talking about tonight and looking at this philosophy around good pedagogy, around assessment. So looking at our timelines here, I'm actually going to ask Trish to dump this video into the chat. We actually gone a little longer than we're planning here too, so our hope is that I just play this video and give you a quick look at it. Actually, you know what? It's only a couple minutes long. It talks about Markboard and their attendance tool called Attendboard in here. I'm going to ask you just to go right now and watch the video on Markboard. It's only about the first 2.5 minutes. So right now, I'm going to turn my mic off and just give people 2 or 3 minutes here to click on the link that Trish just posted in the chat. Just give you a very quick look. This is a video from Markboard about what the tool looks like and how it's used, and then we're going to come back here and talk about how Jamie and I have used it. So right now, I'm just going to ask everybody to leave the chat, go watch that video in their browser for the next 2 or 3 minutes. And then when you're back, if you can just give us a green check mark to let us know that you've watched the video and that you're back. Okay, so right now, click on that link, and I'm going to turn my mic off. You got a few minutes to watch that video. Okay, it looks like a number of you are back from the video now, so if the rest of you are still kind of listening, just finishing up, that's fine, and don't worry about the Attendboard piece. We're just going to focus on Markboard tonight. So that's a very quick intro video, and we leave some links to the other ones for like Seesaw and Sesame and FreshGrade to check out as well. And again, we really recommend that you kind of look around and choose whatever's best for you, but in everything we've spoken to tonight, we actually found Markboard from Chalk.com was a really powerful, phenomenal, and perhaps most importantly, really easy to use tool that kind of made this workflow for us much simpler. So the video gave you a very quick intro. We just want to go through a few slides now for the last 6 or 7 minutes here in the presentation, to give you some ideas of how Markboard works and how you can use it and kind of how you can kind of leverage to do some of the things we've been talking about today. You can, if you just Google Markboard to find their website, or if you go to chalk.com and create an account, again, it's an Ontario-based company. It is a free-to-use tool. Everything we're showing you tonight is on the free side. If you're asking, okay, well, where does the money come from? They do sell to school boards for higher-level things. So where they make their money is if a school board purchases through them, and what that kind of the power it gives you as a teacher then is like your classes will already be there for you with your students in them. If you're using it on the free-based level, you won't have that kind of access. You'll have to add your own students in, create things off of that, and you won't have access to your school's student information system, obviously, whereas if you purchase a school board, you would have that. But that being said, it's a completely free use tool for Ontario educators, and that's where everything we'll be showing you tonight is free. So if you have create a Markboard account or a chalk.com account, and you come into Markboard here, you'll see a screen like this. If you click on the top left-hand corner, it gives you access to a variety of options, and so you can create your semester or your school year, and then you can go and add your subjects and grades. And then the next screen here, so once you're looking to do that, and so you're into Markboard here, this is kind of your basic screen. And so you can see the kind of four main tabs across the top. So you can look at your assessments, you can go look at your students and add students into your classroom. There's a space called Insights, and then finally a space for settings. That's where you set up like your ratings and things along those lines. When you want to create an assessment to assess your students on, it's up in the top right-hand corner there. You can also add observations this way. And moving on from that, this is a screen for me from this semester, and looking at that, so they have what's called a card view. And you can kind of create your assessments. It also ties into your units. I mentioned if you're using Planboard, which is their sister tool for online lesson planning, they talk to each other. So if you create units in your lessons in Planboard, those automatically show up here for in Markboard. You don't need to be using one to use the other, but just there's an option. So if you have a good way to organize your lessons, you don't need to worry about Planboard. If you're looking for something to kind of run your assessments this way, you can use Markboard for that too. One thing I'll mention too, if you're using Markboard, and it's obviously not something that's purchased by your school board, this is a workflow that Jamie and I chose to go through documenting observations, conversations, looking at things like the most recent and consistent, doing the triangulation of data in a very simple and easy way. And we'll get to that in a second. But you need to keep in mind that when it comes to reporting time, you're still going to need to report through whatever the software your board is using. So for our school board, that's a tool called Markbook. And so Jamie and I do all our tracking of our assessments this way. And then when it comes to reporting time for a report card, I would look at all my student data in this. I'm looking at their portfolios in here. I'm looking at the observation conversations I've made with my students and how I've documented that. I'm playing with the students' weightings. I'm arriving at a final mark in Markboard, and then going to my boards tool to input that final mark and then do their comments. So something to keep in mind that you can't just use this tool and then expect your board to accept it. You're still going to have to follow your board's policies for looking at that. So this is the basic screen for Markboard. And then if I click on the settings piece, this is where you can very simply and easily input the weightings you want to be using. We spoke to that a little earlier in the presentation. Again, we've chosen to assess in the way of looking at the 4 strands of our curriculum and weighting them equally over the overall expectations, and then breaking up the sum into 30% to the 4 strands as well too. But you have a great deal of personalization to play around with that and look at that space as well too. Now, one of the most powerful tools that I found in Markboard is what they call Insights. And so what's really interesting in this is in Markboard, they have all of the Ontario curriculum expectations added into it. So for me as an English teacher, I go and I create a class and say it's my grade 10 academic English class. I would search out the grade 10 academic English curriculum. I just click a button and add it to my course, and then I can go and assess by the overall or the specific expectations. Me personally, I think it's a little crazy to try and assess by all 88 or 90 or 100 specific expectations. If you want to that, you can. But as you can see this from this dashboard here, I can actually assess on the overall expectations or again the specifics, and I actually get amazing, powerful tools for tracking for that. So when I create an assessment, I might just click off, click. I might say A1, D4, A2 is what I'm assessing on. And then as I'm going on assessing my students, it's letting me know which students are actually meeting the provincial standard. So you can see the green bar there for A1. That means 26 students in my class at some point this semester have gotten a 70% or higher on A1, the overall expectation of my curriculum. And I can see 3 students have it. And I can scroll down and I can click on it and filter out, say, okay, which are the 6 students in my class that haven't demonstrated A2 at a specific, at that 70% or higher level yet? And then I can do target instruction to those students. So this is a really, really powerful tool for me to track the Ontario expectations and look at what students are meeting and what students aren't, and kind of play off that. So I found that very, very simple and very easy to use. And again, I really love this feature. It's going to give me deep insights into my class as a whole and how they're meeting the expectations of my classroom and my assessments. And so if I click on one, I can see what the actual description of the Ontario curriculum is and look at what students have met it, which students haven't, where they're at. And I can also play around. If you look in the top right corner, it says filtered by. You can do an average of certain assessments. You can say, I want you to average out just the last 2 times that I assessed on A2, as opposed to looking at the 4 or 5 times throughout the semester or the school year that I did it. And so you can look at playing around with that most recent, most consistent piece very simply here too, and how to kind of recalculate for you based off of that. The other thing is you also look at it student by student. So if you go into a student profile, again, these aren't my real students here. I created some dummy profiles here for you. But I can go down, scroll through, and look at a specific student, see their overall grade, and then look at how they're doing on the specific expectations that I've chosen to track. Again, this is up to you for what you want to look at and what you don't. You don't have to use any of this here if you don't want to, but I find it very powerful to scroll through and look at a student and say, okay, how many times did I assess you on this expectation, the curriculum? How did you do on it? Did you show improvement out the semester? And play around with that idea. And then speaking to the student profile a little bit more here too, I'm going to pass over to Jamie here and just kind of let her speak to you just before we finish off the presentation.
Okay, so this is where you can actually add in conversations and observations. It's super powerful. This is what I probably appreciate the most about Markboard, is that within the system itself, whether you're using the app or whether that is, we have it in beta, we're lucky that way, but when it does actually come out, you'll be able to actually make these observations from any device. But it allows you to add in your observations. So for example, last year we went to the Kitchener Youth Forum, which was a really cool experience for us, but you're allowed to add in images. It allows you to add in, when earlier on in the presentation you saw Andrew had added a written conversation or written documentation of a written observation. That's where this came from. You see the yellow down there, it corresponds. You also, it allows you to incorporate video and that kind of thing. So somebody mentioned artifacts of learning, and that's exactly what this allows you to do, is that it allows you to add in and tag it as an observation. So you can incorporate that into your professional judgment. It's really powerful in that context. And then when we look at this, it also allows you to do things like look at your students based on your qualifiers. And so, for example, if you look here, you can see that if you want to see how a student's doing in writing, it allows you to make a rubric within Markboard, and then it allows you to actually see what's going on. And what's really powerful here is that in terms of most recent, most consistent, it allows you to gives you the chance to actually omit a grade. So if you have a student who has done, say, we're looking here at essays, we're looking at writing, and their first piece of writing happened in September and it wasn't that good, there's actually a spot on there where you can actually omit the task. So it still shows up as documented of what their skills were, but you can omit it from their actual grade. And so then therefore it recalculates for you so that you know exactly what the student is able to do. And so here you can see an example, and I'm conscious of the time, but you can see an example of where Andrew had used a rubric as well as used observations of what a student had done. And so this gives him a really great snapshot of what the student was able to do through there. And then, yes, I see we're at 9:02, so I don't want to take anybody's evening away. But if you have further questions, you are more than welcome to contact us via Twitter. We're pretty active there. And this has been a great learning journey for us, so we are really thankful to have had it. And thank you so much for listening in and hearing our story based on the idea of assessment and how we see it going forward into incorporating growing success and all of the great things that are happening in classrooms all across the province.
And I'll just jump in there too and say thank you all for joining us tonight. Again, I'm always blown away by Ontario educators who give their own personal time at evening to do their own development and learning. Please don't disappear yet, though. If people have questions still, Jamie and I are happy to stick around in the chat room for a bit and answer after the fact. But I know Trish is going to want to jump in here, and she's got a few final things to cover with you guys before you leave. So thank you again for joining us, and I will pass the mic over to Trish now.
Oh, perfect timing. Thanks very much, Andrew and Jamie. That was wonderful, and lots of great conversation in the chat box. And just a reminder that you can revisit that once I send you all the links. You'll get an email tomorrow. But first, we need your feedback, and that link is active on there, and I'll also pop it into the chat as well. Once you've finished the feedback form, you get a link for a certificate that you can print out, and tomorrow the resources will be available on the OTF website. And I am going to be stopping the recording, but as Andrew and Jamie said, you can stick around in the chat box as well. I've just got one or two more things to show you. We have 4 sessions left this week, and then we take a little break over the winter holiday, and we'll start back up in January with some great new presentations as well too. And just another reminder that that subsidy for AQ courses is still available if you're taking mathematics, technology, or kindergarten. Don't ever forget to check that one out right there. So at this point, I'm going to stop the recording and thank them once again. That was a terrific presentation once again.